Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to another review roundup, where I talk relatively briefly about all the random games I've been playing lately and what I think of them. This video is going to be pretty heavy on recent AAA games, or at least recent as far as my time to play video games allows. The obvious big thing here is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I'll review here without spoilers, but I've also got new reports for my continued adventures in the God of War and Devil May Cry universes. So without further ado, let's get into it. Final Fantasy VII Remake, completed main plus extra content. In case you couldn't tell from the hour-and-a-half long analysis of Final Fantasy VII, I've been looking forward to this one for years now, and I'm happy to say that overall, it absolutely did not disappoint me. It's a big game that I have a lot of feelings about, but I don't want this roundup to be a half hour, so I'm gonna try and keep this reasonably short. We all have different things we want out of this game, which makes it even more difficult than usual to review it with any sense of objectivity. So, disclaimer that this is a review, and is thus inherently my opinion, and I'll try to explain myself as best I can. But I was overall very pleased with this game. The game is more than just an update or a remaster, it's a recreation and reimagining of the original game, or at least the first fifth of it. People talk about that like it's some big unprecedented thing, but that's usually what remakes are. It's an actual retelling, not just a port or a reskin, and I love that. I love seeing how they chose to adapt various elements of the original game into a more modern and visually advanced product. One of my favorite things they did is actually the battle system. Personally, I have a love-hate relationship with most real-time JRPG battle systems. I've enjoyed games like Rogue Galaxy and Final Fantasy XV and Kingdom Hearts, but these kinds of systems that rely on menus while integrating real-time movement rarely work all that well for me. It tends to be one or the other for me. Fully move away from menu-based combat or stick to it completely, but I generally don't love the hybrids. The FF7 Remake has finally broken that spell, and it did it by actually working to adapt the concept of active time battle system into a real-time action format. The player is repeatedly and constantly attacking enemies, and doing so does very little damage, but builds up the character's ATB meter, which then allows them to take special actions like casting spells, using items, or unleashing powerful attacks. It's basically like the original game's turn-based system, just that the time it takes to perform actions is replaced with a more active way to build up the meter. It's a rather brilliant way to adapt the original game's core gameplay loop into a real-time action system, and I enjoyed it thoroughly from beginning to end as both a game and an updated representation of the original gameplay. But of course, the most important thing here, at least to me, is the character's story and presentation, and wow, did they hit it out of the park with this one. At every turn, the characters were developed and the themes were referenced in ways that made me feel like the game knew what it was doing and understood the story it was trying to retell. Aerith benefits from this the most, I think. The remake's version of the character is very much still the same person, but her playful personality and friendly disposition mixed with a dose of naivete that deceptively masks her maturity and wisdom all comes through so well through the animations, writing, and voice acting. The type of stuff that wasn't really possible in the original game. Meanwhile, Barrett is still presented kind of stereotypically, which is a shame, but the game did do an excellent job humanizing him and revealing his core personality as a dorky, embarrassingly passionate teddy bear. They really just nailed the portrayal of these characters, and that goes a long way here. What few complaints I have are sizable, but mostly forgivable. The Sector 5 bombing segment has been lengthened dramatically, and it really just drags on too long. There are similarly long-winded detours in the Shinra building and the train graveyard, the latter of which is particularly egregious since it really puts a damper on the urgency of the Sector 7 plate situation. In general, actually, there are a lot of parts of that segment in particular that feel weirdly lackadaisical. I do have to admit that was really weird. But while these are all obvious, even frustrating flaws, I think they do very little to dampen the overall quality of the experience. In the end, I loved nearly everything about the game until the last little bit. It's tricky to manage expectations and opinions with these kinds of remakes. Sometimes it seems like some people just want it to be an exact replica of the original, but somehow vaguely but absolutely better. I didn't want that. I didn't expect it to be perfect, and I didn't expect it to be exact. Heck, I didn't want it to be exact. The entire point is to retell the story with modern technology and storytelling sensibilities, and that obviously means changing and updating some things. So I'm not disappointed with plot changes or the different gameplay or anything like that. Honestly, I only have one real complaint on this front, and that's the theme of fate woven throughout the game, leading up to the rather bonkers departure for the ending. I won't spoil the details for those who have yet to play it, and my opinion is very much my own on this. This particular element of the game seems to be quite divisive. Basically, it seems that the vision for the future parts of the remake are determined to chart their own course, and this game has elements that culminate in an incredibly unsubtle declaration of that intent. Personally, I think it derails the game's more compelling and meaningful themes, and as someone who was looking forward to having an updated version of this classic story that could more easily appeal to people who aren't as invested in video games and have trouble getting into older, dated games, I'm concerned about what it means for the direction of future episodes. Like I said, very much an opinion, and one I might expand on in a video once I sort all my feelings out on this a little more, but for now, yeah, I wasn't a fan of how it went. Nomura has since said that future installations will still stick generally to the original story, and I do hope so, but frankly, if that's true, it makes me wonder why they even bothered going so defiantly meta and off-script here. But everything up to that point, pretty much exactly what I hoped it would be. A couple segments that drag on, and a few moments that didn't translate as well as I'd like, are small complaints in the face of such a detailed and loving recreation of a story and characters that I think are absolutely still worth visiting. It's a good retelling of the first part of a classic story, and I am very much here for it. I'm giving it an A, and I'd recommend it not only for fans of the original game, but to anyone who wants to see what all the fuss has been about these last 20 years. Next up, a first for my review roundup videos. Doom Eternal, incomplete. There's a reason I state my degree of completion at the beginning of a roundup. I want to leave room for documenting all kinds of my gaming experiences here, but I hate leaving games unfinished, so this is the first time in these reviews that I actually set a game aside and said enough was enough. Which I'm sure is controversial because I know a lot of people really like this game, but let me try to explain. Obviously, a review based on an incomplete playthrough should be taken with a grain of salt, that's why I'm upfront about it. I can only speak to my experience here, what I thought of what I played, and why I stopped. And no grade, obviously, because such concrete feedback should be more completely informed than I can give it when I didn't finish the game. But in short, I found Doom Eternal to be two things. It's a lot of fun, and it's completely empty. The gameplay is polished to a mirror sheen. The core gameplay loop is very well designed to inspire the player to keep going, keep shooting, keep moving, keep killing, because it's the way you execute up-close kills that gets you more health, ammo, or armor. It's effectively the opposite of the last generation or two's approach of giving you health when you stay out of combat. Instead, you have to constantly dive in, and it works really well. Doom Eternal is a lot of fun, sometimes even incredibly fun. There were times it really felt like I was in an old arena shooter, maneuvering through a battlefield with precision and purpose and narrowly avoiding death until I finally managed victory, and in these moments, the game really does shine. And that's all well and good, and sometimes that can even be enough for me, but this time, it really wasn't. Doom Eternal just had nothing to offer me aside from a few hours enjoyed and some cool visuals. I came out of every play session feeling like I hadn't gained anything from the hours I'd spent. Doesn't help that for some reason it seems to have skipped a lot of extremely important and dramatic and complicated story developments between Doom 2016 and this one. Even if it did have some really compelling narrative content, I probably had trouble picking up on it because I had no idea what was even happening or why, and the closest I got to an explanation was notes I had to pick up and read. You know how Final Fantasy XIII took place in a really confusing and complicated setting and didn't bother explaining it outside of a colossal encyclopedia you had to read to have any earthly idea what was going on? It's like that, except that I actually cared enough about the characters in Final Fantasy XIII for it to carry me. I don't really in Doom Eternal. And all of this can still be fine. A game doesn't need to have some higher meaning or purpose or excellent storytelling, it's just not generally my thing. If you've watched any of my videos, you probably know generally how my opinions work and what my priorities are. I did a video about my favorite games with little to no narrative content, and most of them offer little outside of fun time and maybe a social outlet, but for the most part, I need more substance to really enjoy a game. And if Doom Eternal was shorter, I probably would have finished it fine, but when I was sitting halfway through a game that inspired absolutely nothing in me, knowing I had so much further to go, and it started throwing annoying boss enemies at me as part of the regular swarms, I knew I was done sinking time into it. So Doom Eternal gets an incomplete, and honestly, I'd recommend it if you're into fast, satisfying shooters. It just didn't really do it for me. And now, I'm getting back to an old and annoying tradition. Call of Duty Modern Warfare, like the new one, completed main single-player content. There was a time when I kept up on Call of Duty campaigns, partially because the original Modern Warfare was a legitimately excellent game, and also because the series was a leader of the industry and the shooter genre, and it was interesting, at least, to keep up on what it was doing. But somewhere around Infinite Warfare, I stopped trying, I guess, and I just recently picked back up on the Modern Warfare reboot, prequel, whatever it is. And it kinda sucks because honestly I don't feel like there's a lot to say. It's Call of Duty. It plays exactly like the series has played since 2004. It features a story about slightly outside the law military men fighting against foreign terrorists with devastating weapons. It features a bunch of realistically rendered weapons that, not being a gun nut myself, I can't keep straight, let alone get excited about. It's just exactly what I expected and not really anything more. That doesn't mean it's bad necessarily. These games have always had excellent production values and they're perfectly functional shooters for the Twitch reaction, realistic enough to feel intense but not enough to actually be realistic genre that Call of Duty helped define with the original Modern Warfare. On a gameplay level, the campaign has so little to set itself apart from others in the series that I really, honestly, just have nothing to say about it. At least in terms of the campaign, I frankly have no interest in talking about weapon balancing in the multiplayer modes or whatever, and I doubt that's the kind of content you come to this channel for anyway, so let's do ourselves a favor and skip that. The series has had its share of successes and failures where intense story moments are concerned, and if anything, this one manages to capture both pretty well. There were a couple moments I found legitimately engaging, others I felt were a little exploitative, and in general, I'm just not really on board with the whole premise at this point in the same way I once was. The problem is partially that while the first-person storytelling is generally pretty good, it also isn't as impressive as it once was. They've been trying to capture the same magic for well over a decade now, and everything this game does well kind of reads like standard practice now. The flashback sequence playing as Farah as a child is intense and evocative, but the witness or perform heinous acts in first-person shtick only works about as well as it always has in this toothless series. It wants to make you feel things, but it doesn't want to make you think about them, and it shows. I will say I appreciate that the game tries on a few levels. Making the story about working with Middle Eastern freedom fighters felt like a nice correction from the sorta racist over-reliance on brown-skinned, Muslim-coded terrorists of the series' earlier entries, and it developed the leader of that resistance into a character I cared about well enough to enjoy the story, but none of this makes a good game necessarily just a passable one, and that's ultimately what this is. Passable. A mostly inoffensive popcorn experience that will neither bore nor challenge you in any way. I'm giving it a C and probably never thinking about it again. God of War 2018. Completed main plus extra content. If you've been watching the last couple roundups, you might remember that I begrudgingly respect God of War 1, hate God of War 2, and surprisingly like God of War 3 a lot, but honestly, I only trudged through that awful middle part for the sake of getting here. So, now that I've played it, how is Dad of War? Well, unsurprisingly, I think it's pretty great. Also very, very different in ways both good and kind of confusing. Not that I wanted it to necessarily emulate the games it was based on, as I just said, I have a pretty lukewarm opinion of the God of War trilogy. The gameplay of those games, however good, is also very dated at this point, and I'm glad I didn't have to slowly trudge along ceiling grates or use the right stick to roll or constantly button mash in the middle of bosses anymore. At the same time, it just feels so drastically different in nearly every way that honestly, it almost feels like it wasn't even meant to be part of this series. But that also works in a way I don't think it could with a lot of other games. Kratos doesn't want to be what he was before. It's actually kind of remarkable that the game changed as much of its core presentation and gameplay as it did, as the successor to a beloved and successful trilogy, though frankly the changes are safe, generally speaking, so I'm not sure that's a real point of amazement. It may not feel like God of War, but it does feel like plenty of over-the-shoulder third-person action games made this generation. It doesn't even feel nearly as 2000s edgy as the trilogy. It's not nearly as gleefully brutal, there's no awkward sex minigame or even any nudity. Honestly, I found the distance between the trilogy and this game to be a little disorienting, but also refreshing, and appropriate considering how well it matches the protagonist trying to distance himself from his past. It's also open world now, which I didn't expect. It actually has a very nice system for broadening the available locations and activities as you progress through the game, and honestly, I miss this kind of open world. The kind that lets you explore more as the game goes on instead of just plopping you in the middle of an open area and sending you off to goof around. It gives freedom without sacrificing direction, which is great. What's more, it actually does a really cool thing with how it justifies the open world side questing. It can feel jarring in some games, like dragons are razing villages and burning hundreds of innocent people, but Well, sure, go off on a bender and follow that talking dog, I guess, whatever you want. But God of War's story itself is surprisingly lacking in urgency in the best way, and all side questing is used to frame the tension between Atreus and Kratos. Atreus is naturally both curious and altruistic. He wants to see more of the world, learn more about it, and help people who need it. Kratos isn't as mindlessly angry and violent as he used to be, but he's still very pragmatic. He has no interest in helping others or learning things, he just wants to accomplish his goal. But Atreus will do what his father says, and Kratos will go along with Atreus' sidetracks because they contribute to their strength and experience. Basically, Kratos is the game's representation of the power player, and Atreus is the story player. In other words, the player's approach to optional content plays into the tension between Kratos' values and Atreus' values. How much side questing you do is part of the central narrative conflict, and I think that's pretty cool. Combat is a lot of fun, but also pretty definitely the weakest part of the game, honestly, which I suppose is a testament to how good everything else is on some level. It's a really good base. The customization through gear and abilities is 100% my jam, and the actual act of fighting in the game is pretty fun. But it suffers from a relative lack of unique enemies to fight and unique combat encounters as it goes on. However fun the gameplay is on a base level, it can't help but eventually feel like you've been doing the same thing for hours because you essentially have. There's just not much variance. Not to say it's bad, it just stops from having the same impact that the rest of the game does over time, and eventually it starts to feel pretty grating. Of course, after my thoughts on the trilogy, the main question here for me is how the game handles who and what Kratos used to be. And I think it actually does pretty great, but not in the way I might have expected back when I went on about why God of War 2 is so awful. God of War doesn't actively denounce Kratos' past actions so much as it treats that denouncement as a foregone conclusion. This isn't about realizing why he was wrong. This is the Kratos who already realized that, because that's what God of War 3 was about. This is a Kratos who has worked to be better, knowing that while he can't redeem himself, he can be better, and he can do his best to make sure his son doesn't follow in his footsteps. This is a Kratos who's thrust back into mortal conflict with the gods, who's forced to walk a dangerous line between necessary self-defense and his old, violent ways, and for the purposes of the player, Atreus is a living conduit for that tension. We are constantly terrified that Atreus' growth as a person and a warrior will make him more like Kratos, and it's abundantly clear that Kratos himself has the exact same fear, and doesn't always do a great job at averting it. All that to say, yeah, God of War 2018 knows exactly what and who Kratos was in that original trilogy. It doesn't think he was cool, it doesn't think he was justified, it thinks that he was awful, violent, and uncontrollably angry, and it just knows that. And that's pretty great. I wouldn't say it's the best game ever made, or even the best game of that year, but I would absolutely say it's the best God of War game, and I'm really glad I finally pushed through the original trilogy and played it. I'm giving it an A-, and a recommendation to people who are interested in Norse mythology, enjoy the God of War series, or aren't tired of the dad protecting their child trope in video games yet. And finally, Devil May Cry 2, completed main content. Don't play Devil May Cry 2, you said. They're all good except 2, don't even bother, you said. 2 is an abomination, really seriously, don't put yourself through that, you said. Well, didn't I just prove you all exactly right? I honestly wasn't sure I believed you all when I first started the game. The controls were less awkward, the pointless open world elements are seriously cut back. Honestly, for the first few minutes, it felt like a far better game. But wow, was it quick to decisively prove me wrong. I've heard people say that the guns are significantly overpowered. Honestly, I think they were a bit underpowered in the first one, so that could work, but I think the issue in 2 is a bit more nuanced than that. The game isn't designed for guns to be this powerful. They could fix this by scaling down gun damage, sure, but they could also fix it by designing halfway decent enemy encounters, which Devil May Cry 2 just couldn't be bothered to do. There's an early fight where you're surrounded by a bunch of demon monkey things, and I pretty much just moved around in circles while I held the square button, and Dante auto-aimed his way through the entire thing with barely a scratch on him. And really, the whole game is like that. It suffers from a fairly common problem where the most effective way to win is also the most boring way to play. But it's possibly the worst example of that I've ever seen. It can be kind of fun if you jump in and do the swordplay, but there's rarely any good reason to actually do that. If anything, the game is designed specifically to make the player use the guns as often as possible. The fixed camera angle in this game is somehow even worse than the first, showing a fairly narrow view of Dante that's almost pointed down from above to some degree, making flying enemies in particular a real pain to fight unless you just hold down the square button and let Dante do it all for you. And it's one thing to say all that about the general gameplay, but the boss fights, the boss fights are on a whole other level. Take this guy, whose big attack is a static AoE cyclone of fire that swirls around him, in a game where I can just back off and hold square to wreck him without even getting close. Or even worse, okay, no, I have to talk about this one in more detail because it's one of the most bafflingly bad boss encounters I've ever played. Dante is going through this city when a helicopter attacks. It's a tiny and unfun arena, but what else is new, so I shot it until it died. Then it attacks again later, so I shot it until it died. It took me a few encounters to realize that I was supposed to just run from it. It wasn't threatening enough to make me realize I had to, and the camera work didn't do a very good job indicating that the first time, so I just eventually caught on to the fact that I wasn't trapped in any of these battle arenas and was just wasting my time. So there's this extremely slow-paced chase through the city that's constantly interrupted by the camera zooming forward to show me the obvious next steps. Then I get to the top of a skyscraper for some reason, and now it's time to fight it. I didn't gain any advantage or anything, I just got to a different place and the game decided it's time to actually kill it for real, which is accomplished by, surprise, holding the square button because it rarely ever attacks, it's real easy to avoid when it does, and I can't even see the dang thing. The camera is still at a fixed angle aimed down at me from above, while this bullet sponge hovers above my field of view doing absolutely nothing. It's quite possibly the worst boss fight I've ever played in my life, and I can't believe it actually got to any stage of playtesting, let alone through it. And it's a shame, because there's some potential here. Like I said, the controls are tightened up a bit, and there's also this really cool new character that I liked a lot. For that matter, the story was clearly trying to do more than the first, which is a very low bar that it somehow still failed to clear, because it didn't bother trying to make any sense of it. It just keeps going from point to point without developing or explaining anything. In the end, there's just nothing of value to be found here except as a cautionary tale. I'm not sure I'd say I'm sorry I played it, because its exceptional awfulness was somewhat educational and occasionally entertaining. I did stream part of it and that was actually a lot of fun, but wow, is it an exceptionally bad game. Devil May Cry 2 gets an F, and a recommendation only with mind-altering substances and a few friends to laugh along with you. I'll make sure to get to 3 sometime soon, and hopefully that'll fare better. And there you have it. I've been trying to catch up on a lot of things lately, so the next roundup is likely to be less focused on big AAA releases. And of course, I'm working on the next big analysis, so look forward to that. I'll also be releasing some conversations I had with some of my patrons about various games we all played together, so that'll be out soonish as well. I'll see you next time.